Welcome to this lesson, and in this lesson you're going to be learning about method, parameters, and arguments. Perhaps you might be wondering, for instance, in the previous lesson when we learned or when we introduced about methods, you realize that our variables, we declared them and provided values within the method. You, for instance, may ask yourself, what if you may want to reuse the method but with different variables? Would you have to keep rewriting the method again and again and again? No, you don't have to do that, because there are method parameters and variables. Method parameters and argument which you can take use of. Method parameters and arguments. So what are parameters? Parameters and arguments, it is information that can be passed to a method, and they are normally passed as variables inside the method. So in the same way that in the previous lesson we defined some variables within the method, parameters act the same way, only that they are a bit dynamic, allowing you to reuse the method by supplying different arguments or values. Parameters are specified after the method name and inside the parentheses. You can add as many parameters as you want, and you just separate them with a comma. We are going to take an example that's going to be displaying someone's age, and find out how we can be able to use the same to write a method that takes parameters and arguments. So let's find out. So we are going to write a method, and our method is going to be public static void display age. As we said earlier, we will be explaining about all these keywords, what they mean, in a later lesson. For now, this is how we represent them. So we will learn them one by one as we move on. So we have said that the purpose for the method, parameters, and arguments is so that you can make your function more dynamic, or your method more dynamic, so that it can be able to take on more values or more arguments for its display and also for reuse. So instead of writing a statement like just saying directly, writing it directly in the print statement, let's say for example, James is of age 5. This statement can be quite is not the best way to represent this, especially when you have a program where you would like to display the ages of, let's say, 1,000 people or more than one person, because then that would have to mean that you would have to keep rewriting this statement, and that will not be your desire. So for instance, you would say James is of age 5, Peter is of age 15, Susan is of age 25. Again, another person, let's say John, is of age 35. So, but this is quite repetitive, and you can imagine that in a program, this would not be the best way for you to be able to handle it. What if you had a way of getting these names or telling this function in a smart way that whenever you encounter the James record, please print out James and find out what James' age is, and also print it out. And whenever you encounter Susan record, you can print it as a record, and also find out what the age is, but do not write too many print statements. And that is what I want us to learn in this lesson. That is the purpose of parameters. So let me delete this so that we can write the correct way, so that we can be able to reuse our function. So inside these parentheses or these round brackets, this is where we specify the parameters in the normal way. You have to specify the data type and the name of that parameter, or the name of that variable. As we have said, parameters are used as variables within the method. So we are going to have the name, it's going to be a string, and an int age, which is going to be an integer. Age is going to be an integer. So as we say, you can pass as many parameters in your argument, in your method as possible. For instance, our method is taking two parameters, the name and the age. We have the option of only taking one parameter or even 10 parameters. However, for us, we only need two of them. Again, something to note, you separate them with a comma. So whenever now I want to display the names and ages, I could say something like system.out.println name, which in this case would represent John. We include the part of the sentence or the part of the sentence that is not going to be dynamic, is, of, age, and then we now include the person's age that is going to be passed as an argument in the function. So whenever it encounters, let's say James, is going to replace the name variable with the value, which in this case is going to be James. It's going to say something like James is of age, whatever age has been passed here. So that is James is of age 5. So let's see how this actually works. So let's call this method our method for display age. So, and how do we say that we call a method? By writing out its name, and if it does not take any parameters, you do not write any parameters. However, if it does take any parameters, you would have to provide those parameters. And in this case, our method does take parameters. So we are first of all going to say that the name is James and James is of age 10. So let's find out whether it does actually do what is intended for us. Yes, so it tells us James is of age 10. So in this case, I can now actually reuse this method. For instance, we take this method and try to reuse it for a number of people. So I could now come here and say Peter is of age 20. Another person, Susie, is of age, I could say 15. And Joel is of age 30. So realize that we are using the same method, but we are calling it multiple times. And in this case, as opposed to the previous case, we are not having to write to 10 or 15 or 5 print statements. We just write it once. However, it takes advantage of the parameters. So let's run our program and find out whether it does exactly that. Very good. And so we have James is of age 10, Peter is of age 20, Susie of age 15, Joel of age 30. So that is how you use method parameters and arguments. So just for you to differentiate, this is more theoretical than it is practical. It really doesn't matter your interpretation, but it is always good to, of course, understand the theory behind it. So when we mention parameters, parameters are what you pass whenever you are defining your method. For instance, what we have here, string name and int age, those are the method parameters that the method is going to keep using whenever it is called. Arguments are the values that the method is going to work with. So for instance, James and 10, those are arguments. Peter and 20, those are arguments. However, string name and int age, those are parameters. So before we move on to the next lesson, I would like us to introduce something about method return types. And what are method return types? Method return types, but sometimes you just don't want to display anything within this within your method, and you might want it to perform a particular action and return to you a value. So let's take the example where we want to compute a sum or compute a product. So in this case, let's compute a product, but in this case, we are not going to make that our method print out something, but it's going to return something. So we are going to learn about two important keywords about return types, method return types, and and about the return keyword. So let's have public as usual, public static void compute. Let's just use compute sum because we have learned about method parameters and arguments. Let it take int num1 and int num2. And then within it, because compute the sum, we're going to define a variable called sum. We're going to say that the sum is equal to num1 and num2. Notice how whenever we are using method parameters, we are not providing the values to this method at this particular point in time. We provide those values whenever we are calling that method. So in this method, we have now written the statements or written the logic to actually compute the sum of two numbers. However, we do not want to print out this sum as we have done previously. So how do we do it? Something that you need to realize about return types. So in this case, what I want us to learn is about return types. Let me actually just write it for clarity. Return types. You, for instance, you want your program, if your program, after processing whatever data, whatever input that you have, the final result is an integer, what you return, the return type for that function would be an integer, if at all you want it to return something. And what is to return something? To return something basically means that after the function is called and has finished execution, it's going to have a value within it that you can be able to extract into a variable or either perform other processing with it. The void keyword that we have mostly been using up to now means that the method does not have anything to return. It returns nothing. That's why we say it's void. So that we call it the void return type. It does not return anything. In our case here, we would like to return the sum, which is an integer. And therefore, instead of using void, we would use return an integer. So we would say public static int compute sum. And what does that mean? Whenever we say something like public static int compute sum, it means that this method expects to return a value which is an integer or an integer variable. How do you use the return keyword? The return keyword is very simple. It's just the return word, and then whatever you want to return, you indicate it there as a variable. So what we are simply saying is that this method returns, it's supposed to return an integer, and we have a return statement that says return sum. So we are done with this method. If, for instance, we were returning a string or a double, what would we do? Instead of the string, we would have return string or return double or return float, and so on and so forth, or return a character, and so on and so forth. However, in our case, we are returning an integer value. So we don't need to display this for now. So now let us compute our sum, and remember we have to supply two numbers. So we are going to say int sum equals to compute sum. Compute sum, it takes two parameters. Let's take 10 and 15. So as we have said that our method returns something whenever it computes. So whenever it's going to perform the operation addition on 10 and 50 to give us 60, and store whatever is returned in a variable called sum, so that we can then access it. Then we can print it out. Sum is sum. So let's run the program. Yes, very good. It does as expected. Performs as expected. Sum is 60. Key takeaways from this lesson. Number one, method parameters and arguments. What are parameters? Parameters are variables you pass into the method definition. And for instance, what are the examples? What in our method display age, our method parameters are string name and int age. What are arguments? Arguments are the values you pass whenever you are calling a method. For instance, in our method compute sum, our arguments